The first thing they stripped from her was her name. She had once been Evelyn Hart, wife of a man who promised a better life with calloused hands and a silver tongue. But by the time the townsfolk carved her fate into whispers and courtroom ledgers, they called her the widow, as though her loss defined her more than her breath still did. Evening settled over the town of Ember Ridge like a held breath. Wooden signs creaked. Dust swirled around boots worn by men who had never lost much, and certainly never quietly. Evelyn stood where the town square had once hosted dances and parades, now transformed into something colder, an auction scaffold made of pine and shame. She didn't cry. Not then, not when they told her the debts her husband left behind were now sewn into her name. Not when Marshal Avery, who had once tipped his hat to her in town, declared her property of the court for failure to pay restitution. They used words like service contract and labor settlement, but what it meant was plain: she was being sold. Her dress hung loose. Her boots were borrowed. The bruises around her pride were invisible but aching. They gathered like carrion. Men with coin in their pockets and thirst in their eyes. Some glanced up at her face, but most didn't. The way they studied her was the way one examines a mule or a rifle left out in the rain, calculating, not curious. The sun dipped low behind the church steeple. Shadows crawled across the wooden platform like fingers. Marshal Avery stepped forward, his voice like brittle glass. He read from the paper he held like it were gospel. The list of debts, the so-called legalities, the justifications written by men who had never buried a husband with blood still under their fingernails. Evelyn listened to none of it. She scanned the faces instead. There was Mr. Clark, the man her husband owed poker money to, who once told her she had pretty hands. There was Silas Wren, the rancher with 3 daughters and no wife, chewing tobacco like it was justice. There was young Wesley Tate, who couldn't look her in the eyes. And there was no one else. Not a soul to speak for her. Marshal Avery raised his hand. The bidding began. One voice shouted $5. Another countered with 6.5. She could feel their voices hitting her like stones, chipping away what little of her remained untouched. A woman coughed in the crowd. Someone laughed too loud. A baby cried from inside the general store. She stood perfectly still, as if stillness might make her invisible, as if silence might protect what was left of her dignity. A man called out 10. Her stomach turned. Her heart did not race. It slowed, as if preparing to mourn something that hadn't yet happened but would. She began to forget what her own voice sounded like. Began to forget what it meant to belong to herself. 11. 12. And then, nothing. Not silence, but the absence of noise. A stillness that came from the way one man's voice cut through everything without needing to be raised. "I'll take her home," the man said. Heads turned. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. There was no gavel. No declaration. Just that voice, low and steady, like the hum of thunder far off on the plain. He didn't offer a price. He didn't ask permission. Marshal Avery narrowed his eyes. "This here's an auction, Calder." Thomas Calder didn't blink. He stepped forward through the crowd like he was moving through water, not people. Dust clung to his boots. His shirt was worn. A leather hat shaded most of his face, but not the eyes. They were blue, sure, but not cold. Just calm. Like he knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. He stopped in front of the scaffold. Looked up at Evelyn, not past her, not through her. At her. "I'm not buying a woman," he said. "I'm offering her shelter. That's all." Someone jeered. Another man muttered curses under his breath. But the weight of the moment didn't shift. Evelyn didn't move. Her fingers twitched against the side of her skirt. Her breath caught in her throat. Marshal Avery, for all his steel-backed posture, seemed uncertain. The law didn't account for mercy. It had lines, not choices. And this wasn't written anywhere. "You gonna cover her debts?" Avery asked. Thomas nodded. "If that's what it takes." Another murmur swept the crowd like wind in wheat. Avery didn't like it. Not one bit. But he was a man who liked order more than cruelty. He folded the paper, muttered something about court records, and turned away. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed in a show that ended too soon. Thomas reached a hand up toward her, not to grab, not to pull, but to offer. And for a second, Evelyn didn't move. Because this wasn't safety. This was something worse. Oh, she hadn't felt it in so long, it burned like an old wound. Still she took his hand. He helped her down gently. As though she were made of something precious, not pawned. The two walked away from the scaffold. Slowly. No hurry. No hiding. No one followed. But many watched. And one, somewhere deep in the crowd, whispered her name. Evelyn. Like maybe, just maybe, it still belonged to her. The road out of town was silent but not still. Cicadas sang in the brush. The sun lowered behind the hills like it was trying to hide from the shame it had watched unfold. Evelyn didn't speak. Neither did he. Thomas Calder led the way, reins loose in one hand, the other tucked in the worn pocket of his coat. His horse moved steady beneath him like it knew not to ask questions. Evelyn sat behind him, the side saddle position a quiet compromise between dignity and survival. She kept her back straight and her eyes forward, even as her stomach swayed with each step the horse took. They passed the dry riverbed, the broken fence post that leaned like an old man's back, the half-burnt wagon someone once left for deadwood. These were places she knew. Places she'd once passed with a husband who made promises he couldn't hold. Now, she rode behind a stranger who had said nothing more than what needed saying, and offered her more freedom with silence than most men did with sermons. The cabin came into view just as the light faded to that soft shade of blue that makes shadows blur into sky. It sat on a ridge, flanked by crooked trees and a porch with a single rocking chair that looked like it had stories of its own. Thomas dismounted and held the horse steady while Evelyn slid off, her boots touching the ground like she wasn't sure she belonged there yet. He didn't lead her inside. Just opened the door and stepped back. She crossed the threshold like a woman entering a church she hadn't prayed in for years. Inside was small but clean. A stone fireplace. A shelf of books that leaned together like drunks after a long night. A stove, some candles, and a cot made up with folded linen so neatly it made her chest ache. "You'll sleep here," he said simply. She nodded. "There's stew in the pot. If you're hungry." She wasn't sure if she was. Hunger had become more about habit than need. Still, she murmured something close to thanks and sat at the small wooden table. Thomas ladled the stew into a bowl and set it in front of her without a word. Then he moved to the other side of the room and began removing his coat like a man trained to give space. Evelyn took a bite. The broth was thick, seasoned with time and kindness. "You live here alone?" she asked, voice hoarse from hours of disuse. "Mostly," he replied, hanging the coat on a hook by the door. "Got a neighbor down the ridge. Old Mr. Buckley. He visits when he forgets how to be lonely." She didn't smile, but something in her chest softened. "And why'd you do it?" she asked after a long silence. "Step in like that?" Thomas turned to look at her. "Not hard, not intense, just steady. 'Cause I've seen what happens when no one does." That was all he said. But it was more truth than she'd heard in years. She slept that night with one eye open, her hands curled beneath her pillow and her boots within reach. Just in case. Morning came gently, the sun painting the floorboards in golden stripes. She awoke to the smell of coffee and a pan sizzling on the stove. Thomas sat on the porch, whittling something from a block of pine. He didn't look up when she stepped outside. Just motioned with his head toward the kettle. "Help yourself." She poured a cup. Sat beside him. Close enough to share the same breeze, far enough not to blur boundaries. "What are you making?" she asked. He held up the carved piece. It was rough, not finished. A horse maybe. Or a woman's figure. She couldn't tell. "Something to keep my hands busy," he said. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't demand conversation to feel full. Over the next days she cleaned. Cooked a little. Folded his shirts because her fingers needed something to do. He didn't stop her. Didn't praise her either. Just let her be. At night she read his books. Poetry. A few sermons. A worn copy of Leaves of Grass that smelled like pipe smoke. She asked about his past once. He said he'd been a cattleman, a brother, a boy who once tried to run east before realizing peace wasn't something you found on maps. He never asked about her past. And that, more than anything, earned her trust. They didn't speak of the auction. Of the men who had offered coin for her body like it was nothing more than a bedroll with a heartbeat. But sometimes, when she stirred soup or pressed linens, she'd catch him watching her, not with pity but with something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. On the fifth evening, a visitor came. An old woman named Penny, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. She brought bread and gossip. Said she taught school until her knees gave out and her patience thinned. "You staying here now, Miss Hart?" she asked over tea. Evelyn hesitated. "Just until I find footing." Penny smiled with one side of her mouth. "Ain't no shame in rest before the next climb." After Penny left, Evelyn stood by the window watching the fireflies stitch light into the dark. Thomas spoke from behind her. "You don't have to stay." She turned. "I know." He nodded. "You don't have to leave either." She didn't answer. That night, she dreamt of a field of wildflowers growing from burned ground. Her younger self was there, holding a lantern. "We don't always get to choose where we begin again," the girl whispered. But we still get to choose. The next morning, Evelyn packed her things. Just a small satchel. Some bread wrapped in cloth. A scarf. A book of poems. She left a note folded beside the kettle. Thank you. I had to go before I forgot who I am. She didn't cry when she walked away from the cabin. Didn't look back. Not then. The land opened in front of her, wide and waiting. She didn't know where she was going. Only that she couldn't stay. And behind her, inside a quiet cabin on a quiet ridge, a cowboy read her note and folded it carefully like something precious. He didn't chase her. He just left the porch light burning, in case she ever chose to come back. The road she chose was narrow, carved more by deer than men. It wound past scorched sagebrush and dry creek beds that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Dust clung to her hem like old guilt, and every step forward felt like walking out of a dream she wasn't sure she had the right to leave. Evelyn didn't cry. She just walked. The first night, she slept under a cottonwood that moaned in the wind like it was mourning something too. The stars blinked above, far and aloof, as if they'd seen too much of people like her. She held her satchel close, one arm curled beneath her head, the other gripping the poetry book like it was a shield. The second day brought sun so sharp it peeled her skin. She passed a farmer's fence but dared not ask for water. She still carried a tin flask Thomas had slipped into her bag without a word. She drank it slowly as if rationing both liquid and memory. By dusk, she reached a small town she didn't know the name of. Its main street was narrower than ember ridges, lined with cracked signs and shuttered windows. A church bell rang though no one seemed to be listening. She found shelter behind the livery stable, curled beside an old hay barrel. Hunger whispered to her bones, but she quieted it the way she'd learned to quiet sorrow, by remembering worse days. In the morning she heard coughing from somewhere nearby. Sharp rasp. A child's cough. She followed it. Behind the general store, tucked in the shadow of discarded crates, lay a young girl no older than 6, skin pale with fever and lips cracked with thirst. Beside her, a baby fussed softly, wrapped in threadbare linen. Their mother slumped nearby, eyes fluttering open at Evelyn's approach. I don't want trouble, the woman croaked. You've already got it, Evelyn said gently, kneeling. She reached into her satchel, broke off the bread and passed it piece by piece. Poured what little water remained into the girl's mouth. The mother wept, not loud but like it hurt. I'll fetch help, Evelyn promised, and for the first time in days her legs ran. A healer's hut stood at the edge of town, marked with faded symbols and a half-buried totem pole. Evelyn knocked until the door opened. A woman stood there. Tall. Skin like burnished mahogany. Hair braided in silver coils that shimmered like water in moonlight. Her eyes were so dark they seemed to hold night itself. Alma Crow didn't ask questions. She only nodded, gathered her satchel of herbs and tinctures and followed. Hours passed. Alma Crow worked in silence, her hands sure, her face expressionless. Evelyn helped, passing cloth, holding the baby, pressing cold rags to the child's head. After the fever broke, Alma Crow looked at Evelyn and said, You carried too much for one set of shoulders. I'm fine, Evelyn replied. You're not, Alma Crow answered, but that's all right. She let Evelyn stay. Not out of pity, but because she saw something useful in her. The kind of quiet strength that could grind grain or hold hands through long nights. Evelyn swept floors, helped grind roots, read aloud to the sick when their minds drifted. She stitched clothes, watered the herb garden, and began to feel like less of a ghost. Sometimes Alma Crow would speak while stirring her teas. People think water carves stone with force, she said once, but it's patience that does it. Evelyn didn't ask what she meant. She already knew. Still, she didn't feel settled. Not entirely. Something inside her remained untethered. She woke some nights thinking of the cabin. Of a porch lamp that might still be burning. Of stew and silence. Of a man who looked at her and didn't flinch. But it wasn't love she missed. It was space. The kind she hadn't believed she deserved until someone gave it freely. She walked every morning along the creek outside Alma Crow's hut, where a trickle of water still ran between mossy stones. The air smelled of sage and pine bark. One morning, while gathering chamomile, she heard a horse approaching. She stood, brushing off her skirt. A man rode in. Broad-shouldered. Young. His boots too clean. His eyes too sharp. He dismounted before the dust had even settled. Looking for Evelyn Hart, he said. She tensed. What for? The man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. You're a hard woman to find. She stepped back. I'm not someone you need to find. Didn't say I needed to, he said. Only that someone paid to know where you ended up. Her blood ran cold. A name flashed in her mind, Clark. Or worse, someone newer. Another man who thought she came with a receipt. I don't belong to anyone, she said quietly. He raised a brow. Everyone belongs to someone out here. That's just the way things go. A wind kicked up. Leaves rustled like warning. Alma Crow stepped from the hut. You best leave, she said. The man tilted his head. This your land? No, Alma Crow said. But she's under my roof. That makes her mine to defend. The man laughed, but it sounded hollow. I'll be back, he said. No, Alma Crow replied. You won't. When he turned to leave, Alma Crow whispered something under her breath. A prayer maybe. Or a curse. Evelyn couldn't stop shaking. Later, as they packed her satchel, Evelyn asked, what if he comes back? Alma Crow handed her a polished stone, cool and smooth. You'll know where to go when it's time, she said. You already do. Evelyn left that evening, wrapped in a shawl Alma Crow had woven from dust-colored wool. She walked with steady feet and a tighter grip on the satchel. She took the long path, past the creek, over the ridge. Every step forward now carried purpose. She was not fleeing. She was choosing. On the second night, a storm broke open above her. Rain poured in silver sheets. Thunder rolled like drums of warning. She found shelter under a broken shed and waited until morning. Soaked, cold but not afraid. She remembered Alma Crow's voice. Water doesn't ask for permission. It just goes where it's meant to. By the fourth day, the trees began to look familiar. And by the fifth, she saw the smoke rising from a chimney at the edge of the land. The cabin stood where she'd left it. Still, silent, unchanged. Except it wasn't. Not really. Because this time she was walking toward it by choice. She didn't knock. Just stepped up the porch, paused, and opened the door. Inside, Thomas sat at the table, carving another figure. He looked up. Not surprised. Not shocked. Just steady. I brought your flask back, she said, placing it gently on the table. He nodded. Said nothing. But the way he looked at her. Like someone watching spring return after a long, cruel winter. That said enough. The door didn't creak when it closed behind her. Just fell shut like it had been waiting. Thomas didn't ask why she came back. He didn't ask where she'd gone. Instead, he slid the kettle over the flame and poured water into a chipped tin pot, as though tea could bridge what silence left unspoken. Evelyn stood by the hearth, her shawl dripping rain into the cracks between the floorboards. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of coming home to a place that hadn't asked her to change first. She watched him move, quiet, methodical, familiar. There was no performance in him. No need to explain his kindness. That was what made it dangerous. That was what made it real. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. You hungry? She nodded. And that was how they began again. Over the next week they said little. They tended to their chores like nothing had broken between them, though something had, and something else had been born in its place. She gathered herbs near the edge of the property. He mended fences with a rhythm that steadied the whole land. And when they sat on the porch in the evening, they said nothing of love, but breathed it anyway. Then came the letter. Miss Penny brought it, along with bread and questions she didn't speak aloud. She left it on the table, wrapped in twine and dust. Evelyn opened it slowly, her fingers careful, as if peeling back something sacred. Inside was a name she hadn't heard in months. Sophie. A girl no older than 17. Orphaned. Alone. The town was planning an auction again under the same pretense. Debts unpaid, guardianship reassigned. A public settlement arranged by men who wore collars too tight and consciences too loose. They're doing it again, Evelyn said, voice hollow. Thomas set down his mug. Then we don't stay quiet. The next morning, Evelyn dressed in the blue skirt Alma Crow had gifted her and braided her hair with lavender. She pinned the letter to her shawl. Her boots carried her down the ridge, through tall grass and still air, past old ghosts who no longer knew her name. By the time she reached Ember Ridge, the townsfolk were already gathering. The scaffold had been rebuilt, stronger, taller, uglier. Marshal Avery stood near it, flanked by the same men with the same hollow gazes. The girl stood alone, wrists bound, chin raised. Evelyn remembered that pose. How stillness could be the last act of rebellion when dignity had nowhere else to go. She stepped forward, past whispers, past gasps, past the memory of her own auction that still haunted these boards. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I know what this is, she said, looking at each face, steady as flame. You dress it in law, in debts, in morality. But we all know what it is. No one moved. You think pain makes a woman yours. That silence means agreement. That desperation is consent. You call it kindness. You call it order. But I've lived through it. And I won't let her carry it too. A murmur stirred. Some shuffled. Others looked down. Thomas stepped beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. We'll cover her debts, he said simply. Marshal Avery's jaw tightened. She's not property. Evelyn stepped forward. Then stopped treating her like she is. There was silence then. Thick, waiting. The kind that held breath. And then slowly the girl's ropes were cut. She stumbled forward into Evelyn's arms. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a line drawn. And for some townsfolk, maybe just a few, that line held. Later they brought Sophie to the cabin. She didn't speak for 2 days. But when she did, it was Evelyn who listened, who passed her stew and stories, who taught her how to pull weeds from the herb garden and how to boil thyme for coughs. The girl's laugh came slowly, hesitant, then real. Evelyn began writing letters. To Penny. To Alma Crow. To a woman in another town who had once sewn bandages in secret for hurt girls. She didn't call it a movement. She just called it what it was. Kindness with teeth. The town changed. A little. They no longer auctioned women. At least not where eyes could see. But sometimes all it takes is someone watching. And Evelyn, she never stopped watching. One afternoon, Thomas stood at the edge of the field, staring out at the corn rising tall and golden. Do you ever think of leaving? He asked. She stood beside him. Sometimes, she answered. But not like before. He waited. I used to run because I was afraid of staying, she said. Now I stay because I've finally got something worth building. He reached for her hand. Didn't grab it. Just held it like a promise. That night they sat on the porch as a storm rolled in. Not a violent one, just rain soft enough to speak through. Sophie sat near the window, reading aloud from leaves of grass. Evelyn closed her eyes, listening. Not for danger, but for peace. When the wind blew, it carried the scent of lavender and wood smoke and something else. Oh. Years later, when they asked her what changed the town, she never gave speeches. She just said, the day the town looked away, I didn't. And maybe that's how it happens. Not with flames or fury, but with someone who's been through fire standing still and saying, not her, not this time, not again. And someone else hearing that and believing it. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment.